Hello there, I'm Elliot with Techco, and today I'm here chatting with Sean Ammirati. And this week he's launching a new book, The Science of Growth. It'll be hitting your virtual bookshelves and pretty much anywhere else that you'd like to get some great entrepreneurship reading. Before we kind of really dig into that and figure out what that is all about, Sean, can you tell us a bit about your background?
Absolutely. And first of all, thanks for having me, Elliot. So my background is I dropped out of grad school at Carnegie Mellon about in 2001 and started my first startup. I did three startups over about a dozen years. The first two were in the machine learning, big data space, one in finance and one in media recommendations. And then the third startup I did, I was COO at Read Write Web. That's how I got to know you and Frank and a lot of the folks probably in your community. But I was at Read Write for a couple of years running everything non-editorial. And then when we sold that business to Say Media, I'd already gone back to teaching at Carnegie Mellon, decided I wanted to spend more time doing that and time working with entrepreneurs in general. So instead of doing another startup myself, ended up joining Birchmere Ventures, which is a seed stage fund here in Pittsburgh and San Francisco, where we ended up making, we've been investing for the last 5 years. So at this point, I really teach at CMU Monday evenings and then work at Birchmere.
Very cool. So just out of curiosity, at what point did you really decide that it's time to write this book, your first book?
Yes, this is my first book. So it's sort of a circuitous path from starting to turning it into a book. So the first course that I taught at CMU, and I still teach to this day, is the Graduate Lean Entrepreneurship course. So broadly, it's taking the Lean Startup methodology and turning it into an academic course. And I've been teaching that now at CMU for 5 years. And a couple years into that course, I had a master's student in robotics really challenged me to take a look at the same kind of methodologies and best practices that we had shared in Lean to go from idea to product market fit. Like, could we do a complementary course from product market fit to scale? And so started looking for a book like Eric's Lean Startup that I could use as the basis for that course and start pulling stuff together. And I really didn't find something that I was happy with. And so started taking some of the best students from my Lean class and having them work with me on case studies, which ultimately led to a pretty interesting research agenda for a few years at CMU, and then ultimately a course. And then the course kind of took on a life of its own. So that was how we stumbled into turning this into a book. That was really never the intention when we started on this kind of 3 years ago.
Sure. I mean, that makes a great deal of sense. Obviously, the lean startup strategy is pretty well known, and it's implemented across a lot of different organizations. Startups, of course, is one of the more primary audiences. But obviously, the biggest gap area here is how do you grow actually after you've established your foundation?
Right. So, I mean, no, I've never met an entrepreneur who says, I want to start my company and get to product market fit. Right. I mean, that's certainly a point on the map, but people start companies to change the world. Sure. And so I think this is an important topic. I also think for a lot of entrepreneurs, for different reasons, they may not leave school and immediately go do a startup. And so for a lot of them, this is helpful. It's become a helpful course on kind of how can you think about joining that Series A finance company that's ready to scale. And then to your point on this being used outside startups as well, I do a lot of exec ed work at Carnegie Mellon as well. And it's interesting in that context, this question of scale is even more important, right? Because the bar to a meaningful investment or mean return on investment for kind of an entrepreneur is pretty significant. So,
absolutely. Personally, I'm incredibly excited to be able to get the book and actually be able to dig into it and review it. And learn about, the various organizations that you've highlighted and how they've been able to successfully grow and basically leave someone with a sort of similar model and basically just leave them in the dust. If you had maybe only a minute or less to tell someone about this book and why they should read it, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so I would say the book gives you sort of maps for you the three phases that these companies go through to grow. So there's a section which I call the prerequisites that will look very familiar to people familiar with the lean startup methodology, but more focused on how you know if you're ready to scale or not. Then a series of different techniques you can use to dramatically increase awareness, which we call catalyzing events. And then finally, a series of long-term elements to help you sustain that exponential growth once that growth takes off.
Very cool. So are there any, or I guess the best way to put it is, are there specific key takeaways that you really want someone to come away with after having read this?
Yeah, so my hope is that there will be two things that people will leave the book with. One is an understanding where their innovation is across those three cycles, or those three, not cycles, but 3 points. Because I think getting ahead of yourself is extremely dangerous, right? And so you want to be focused on the right things at the right point in time. And then the other thing is, in much the same way that I think Lean has given us vocabulary to talk about things that entrepreneurs have been doing for a long time. I'm not sure that there's anything that people will read and they'll be like, wow, I've never heard of anybody doing this before, but I hope it gives us vocabulary and a framework to think about, okay, when I'm at this phase of growth, so I know that my product solves a real problem for a meaningful number of people in an excellent way. Okay, what do I need to be focused on? And then what's the shorthand I can talk to my colleagues about the point that we're at in that process?
Absolutely. And, for our readers, obviously we have a pretty big background as far as tech startups and organizations kind of related to that, but not all of the examples that you actually highlighted are just tech startups. What kind of organizations are going to be in this that people can also kind of compare and contrast and see how some of their models actually are going to be applicable regardless of what industry they're in?
Yeah, so that's actually been something that's really fun with this. So the cases that we picked are probably not surprisingly driven by student interest. And so being a Carnegie Mellon project, they're mostly tech companies, right? It's Facebook, Friendster, Tesla, Fisker, those kind of things, WordPress, movable type. But, students have a variety of interests. And one of the things we really wanted to do was look at these best practices and sort of test them against maybe more historical examples as well. So we did like McDonald's White Castle, for example, which is certainly not a tech company, right? But what you see is that, almost 100 years ago now, but when McDonald's and White Castle were first starting out, a lot of these same principles applied. We don't get into as much of this in the book because of confidentiality, but we've also tested this with a lot of large Fortune 500 companies and their innovation groups. And it's been interesting to work with pharmaceutical companies, chemical companies, industrial companies, and have them take their new product and service introduction and sort of map it against the same framework and see benefit from it as well.
Very cool. So would you say there's a limit of any kind as far as to what size or what stage of an organization is when they kind of implement and try to take some of these takeaways and apply them to what they're doing?
Well, I think the risk would be getting ahead of yourself, but we try to map the entire life cycle of innovation here. And we also try really hard to not say absolute numbers, like the market needs to be at least $1 billion, right? We think it's up to each entrepreneur to decide how big is big enough for him or her. But the point is we want to give them a framework to kind of think through those questions and then capture as much of that market as possible.
Yeah, and I think that makes a great deal of sense as someone who kind of works in marketing and tends to be held very accountable for those growth metrics. Trying to look at another organization and be like, yeah, I can just stamp and repeat what they're doing. It's just totally an impossible feat and doesn't make any sense.
Right. I mean, so part of the interesting thing on this course early on, right, was it also stemmed kind of personally my interest in this with the frustration of entrepreneurs who are like, well, I'll just hire one of these sort of magical growth hackers and then everything will be solved, right? And that's nice, and I really appreciate the support that community has provided through this research. Sean Ellis has been a great supporter of this work and actually blurbed the book and everything. But from my perspective, the recommendations around growth are much more nuanced than that, right?
Absolutely. And people also tend to, well, some don't quite realize it. And I've worked and interviewed and had many conversations with early stage startups, especially in the tech space. A lot of them do actually try to go with that growth hacker approach. They don't bring on a a traditional marketer, they'll bring on this person with these crazy ideas, but they don't realize that the amount of money or time doesn't always equate to the kind of growth that they want. They're typically pretty high risk campaigns too.
Well, I think yes. I mean, I think you have to decide the right approaches to yourself, but I also think
Right.
it's not a role in the company.
Sure.
Once you satisfy these prerequisites and you're just trying to focus on growth, it's everybody in the org, right? And if everybody in the organization is not focused on this, you've got, much more significant problems to deal with.
Absolutely. So realistically, it's more of a holistic approach, and everyone plays a part in it.
That's right.
Very cool. So was there a particular method for choosing the companies you compared and analyzed? Obviously, you said that there was input from the students, but was there any kind of qualifications or anything like that?
The method was very much student driven, right? And people often try to contrast this with like some of Jim Collins' work, like Good to Great, Built to Last. I think this is an important delineation between that. In those cases, he's ultimately looking at public companies, so you can do stock screens to end up with the bucket of companies to analyze. That's not what we've done here. It was a much more qualitative process of selecting the companies to focus on. But we did try to, it started almost 100%. It started 100% tech, to be transparent, and then we tried to sort of round them out with interesting case studies to test these, pressure test these theories against some other individuals as well.
Very cool. And were there any any findings in particular that you would say actually surprised you and the students as they were kind of looking through this?
I mean, a lot. So, when we started this research, the goal was more to end up with a checklist of these are the things you should do to help grow, which I think probably would have been a much more popular book and easier to digest course.
Sure.
But it's just not what we found. So we've been disingenuous to say like, hey, here's a book about 5 things you can do to grow. Certainly at a point in your development, there are things you can do, but it's sort of more holistic than that. So that was part of it. I also really enjoyed watching the students kind of see these common patterns across the companies. I think it's often easy to over select on the dependent variable and this type of research, where you take a bunch of companies that have succeeded and you say, oh, these people did X, so therefore that must have led to success. Well, that's the importance to me of having the Friendster or the Fisker control group to test this against.
Very cool. So when you were kind of comparing it to those organizations who did not quite make it as far as like if it was the Friendster versus Facebook, are there any kind of common trends between those who just didn't quite hit that growth marker that's basically help you identify things to avoid doing?
Yeah, I mean, so we tried to find control group examples in each of the things we were talking about. So in the book, we don't just talk about, for example, what Facebook did, but we also highlight things that sort of missteps that places like Friendster did as well. This is all secondary research, but service solutions like Core and things like that, it's amazing how transparent a lot of these internet companies are, which is another advantage to doing this with tech companies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that makes a great deal of sense. So I think I've got a pretty good grasp of what this book is, and I'm incredibly excited to be able to dig into this and get a solid review out.
Awesome.
Yeah. So where can people get your book? I believe it's going to be released this week then.
It's released Tuesday, the 26th, so tomorrow. And it will be, it's already available for pre-order in Amazon and Barnes & Noble. It's also an Audible book, so if you prefer to listen, not read, you can do that. And it should be in the local bookstores that you enjoy frequenting as well. A lot of the local booksellers have been really supportive, which we appreciate as well. So, and if they don't have it, ask them for it, because distribution is key at this point.
Very cool. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to add about this book and really drive home why people would be interested in reading the book and what they'll be able to, again, take away with it?
Yeah, I mean, so my hope is for entrepreneurs that they'll take a look at this and it will give them the tools that ultimately help them achieve their dreams, right? I believe entrepreneurs at the end of the day are people who look out into the market and see things that aren't the way they should be in the market and build products and services to solve that problem. And so my hope is that this becomes a tool to help those entrepreneurs make the world more the way it ought to be.
Absolutely. And again, personally, I think this is just a fantastic mindset, whereas those who typically focus too much on growth or too early on and they kind of go with the growth hacker approach, they tend to invest their funds in kind of odd places, like throwing all their money in ad spend. So I think a more holistic approach makes a great deal of sense.
Awesome. Thanks, Elliot. I appreciate that.